After listening to the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2 more times than I would like to admit, I started noticing a pattern. Something was missing. So I tried to figure out what it was. Was it a particular instrument, some more energetic rhythm? Did the music feel too repetitive to a point where it lacked variation? Or was it something completely else? And then it struck me. But with the realization of what was bothering me about the soundtrack came a second realization. It was intentional. And suddenly, it made a complete sense why the music sounds the way it does. So today we're going to take a closer look at this wonderful soundtrack, break down its nuances, and by the end of the video, solve the mystery of this missing element. And as it turns out, that missing element has a lot to do with our main character, James Sunderland. So let's dive into it. So let's start with something that I think Silent Hill 2's soundtrack does incredibly well. It sounds like a memory. And I don't mean that the music sounds old. What I mean is that the music has this strange quality where the events the music describes feel like happened long time ago. Something familiar, something emotional, but also something that's not 100% reliable. And if you have played Silent Hill 2, that basically sums up the whole game, right? James comes to Silent Hill after receiving a letter from Mary, his wife.
I got a letter.
Except Mary has been dead for the last 3 years.
He died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
So we're already off to a fantastic start. Most people would probably read the letter, have a small existential crisis, and then call somebody, right? James decides to walk into this torn apart town that is filled with extremely thick fog. And did I mention that the town is also infested by these twisted, creepy monsters? Because the town is definitely infested with those creepy, twisted monsters. And even creepier people.
You think I don't see it?
So yeah, James does all of this. Because that's the most sensible thing to do in this point. And from this point on, the game is basically just one exploration of a memory. James remembers Mary. He remembers their relationship, he remembers the hospital, he remembers Silent Hill. But as we progress through the game, we come to the realization that James doesn't have necessarily a reliable relationship with his memory. Things aren't quite what they seem. And this is where the soundtrack becomes really interesting. Because the music behaves almost like James's memories. It gives us something familiar, and then changes it. A melody might be beautiful on its own, but the sound around it might be distorted. Some things might feel nostalgic, but there's always a hidden sense of something being uncomfortable underneath that. A musical idea might return, but it doesn't necessarily feel the same the next time it does. And that's really important idea, because memories don't work like recordings. We don't simply press play and hear exactly what happened, right? Every time we remember something, we are reconstructing it in our brains. And Silent Hill 2 soundtrack often feels like it's doing the same thing. And there's probably no better way to hear this than in Promise. The first thing you'll probably notice is the melody. It's beautiful, it's melancholic, and it's incredibly memorable. But listen past the melody. Listen to what's happening beneath that. There is a strange feeling of tension. The music is moving somewhere, and it feels like it's going to arrive somewhere. But then, it doesn't. Not quite. And this was the thing I kept noticing throughout the soundtrack. The music constantly feels like it's asking questions, but instead of answering it, it just shrugs it off, right? Figure it out yourself. And that sounds like a joke, but it's actually a really important part of how the soundtrack works. Because music creates expectations. If I play a chord that creates tension, your brain almost immediately starts manifesting another one that resolves the initial chord. Same with the melody. If the melodic contour leads to some note that would resolve the part, that would resolve the motif, your brain starts to expect that note. And when the music gives you what you expected, it feels good, right? It feels resolved. It's like a dopamine hit. but when the question doesn't get its answer, it feels unsatisfying, it feels incomplete. It's the ultimate form of blue balls in music. And the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2 does have a bit of a problem with answering those questions. And this is where we finally get to the mystery that I was talking about in the beginning. Because when I first noticed this, I wasn't exactly thinking about unresolved harmony, unresolved sequences, unresolved melody, right? I wasn't sitting there going, oh yes, the lack of harmonic resolution is clearly a representation of James's fractured psyche. I'm not that smart. I wish I was, but I'm not. Instead, I was basically thinking, why does this sound weird? And eventually I realized that most of this strange feeling comes from the unresolved harmony. Now, if you're not familiar with music theory, don't worry. I'm not gonna turn this into a music theory lecture. The basic idea is pretty simple. Harmony creates tension. Harmony creates this musical journey of taking us from point A to point B. And tension is the main way in which it makes the journey interesting. So tension wants to go somewhere, it wants to resolve. Once again, you hear something unstable and your brain almost immediately starts waiting for it to be resolved, starts waiting for the stable thing. You hear a musical question and you expect an answer. But if the answer never comes, you remain suspended, unresolved. And that's what happens again and again in Silent Hill 2. The soundtrack creates these little moments where you expect the music to settle, but instead it moves somewhere else, or it repeats, or the phrase ends just abruptly, or it just simply disappears. And that creates this strange emotional effect. It's not that the music is unfinished, it's unresolved, deliberately. And once I started thinking about that, I couldn't stop thinking about James. Because what is James doing throughout the whole game? He's trying to resolve something. At first, he thinks he's trying to find Mary, but the further he goes into Silent Hill, the more obvious it becomes that he is looking for an answer. What happened to Mary? Why did she write the letter? Why is she here? Why does everything feel familiar? And eventually, what did James do? Because it's not like James is suffering from amnesia. He lives in a denial. And that's a very different thing. He knows something has happened. He just isn't ready to confront it. So he creates a version of reality that he can live with. Mary is waiting for him. She's somewhere in Silent Hill. Maybe there's some explanation for all of this. And every time the game comes close to the truth, James decides to not face it. And that's exactly where the unresolved quality of the music starts to make sense. The music is constantly suspended between one thing and another. Just like James. He's suspended between memory and reality, between love and resentment, between guilt and denial, between wanting to remember Mary and trying to forget what happened. And that's why I think the soundtrack's lack of resolution works so well. It's not simply creating a spooky atmosphere, it's putting us inside James's head. We are hearing what his psychological state feels like. And this brings us back to Promise, or more specifically, Promise Reprise. Because the word reprise basically means that something is returning, and that is almost a perfect word for Silent Hill 2. James keeps returning to the past, he keeps returning to his memories, he keeps returning to Mary. But those memories don't exactly stay the same. They change as James gets closer to the truth. And that's something that Yamaoka can communicate through his music incredibly well. You can just take a set melody and bring it back later, but change the instrumentation, change the harmony, change the texture, and suddenly this musical idea can mean something completely else. That's how I think the music of Silent Hill treats memory. It doesn't simply remind us of the past. It shows us how the past feels when we're looking at it through James's increasingly fractured perspective. And then we get to the endings. And this is where things get really interesting, because Silent Hill 2 doesn't have one ending. It has several, and depending on how James and you as a player behave throughout the game, the story can end in a very different ways. And I think that's important musically as well, because we have spent the entire game listening to a music that often feels unresolved. So, what happens when we finally reach the end? Does the music resolve? Well, sort of. Let's start with the Leaf ending. James finally confronts what happened. He accepts that Mary is dead, and he accepts the responsibility for it. And, importantly, he decides to keep living. Now, obviously, this isn't exactly a Disney ending. Nobody is singing, there are no fireworks going off. James is still carrying an enormous amount of guilt, but he accepts reality. And that matters. Because resolution doesn't necessarily mean that everything becomes happy all of a sudden. Resolution means that something has finally been confronted. And the music reflects that sentiment. Because this is the happy ending, the good ending. And the track that accompanies it is one of the saddest on the tracks. Or not, sad isn't the best word to use. It's haunting. It's fucking scary, right? So James finally stops running from the truth and comes to an acceptance, right? He finally has an answer. It hurts, but it's an answer. And then we have In Water ending. And that is almost the complete opposite. James reaches the truth, but he doesn't find peace in it. He finds guilt. And instead of accepting that guilt, he lets it consume him. And he ultimately chooses death. And I think this is where the idea of musical resolution is very interesting. Because discovering the truth isn't necessarily the same thing as resolving it. James can know what he did. He can remember it. But he doesn't have to accept it. And in this ending, he doesn't. So the cycle doesn't really resolve. It closes in on itself. And that makes the ending incredibly tragic. The question that's been hanging over the game has been finally answered. But the answer doesn't save James. And then there's Maria, which is perhaps the most frustrating ending you can get. Because like, James, mate, we've been together for the last tens of hours trying to figure out this game, trying to figure out this story, just for you to do it all again. In this ending, James basically chooses to repeat this whole cycle. He leaves Silent Hill with Maria, but Maria isn't Mary, and James knows that, right? Which means he actually hasn't resolved anything. He simply found another way to avoid dealing with it. And this is where the idea of repetition becomes very important. The music keeps returning to ideas. James keeps returning to memories. And now James is returning to the same emotional situation. The cough that Maria has at the end of the game suggests that she's gonna have the same disease that Mary did. So James is gonna go through this whole cycle basically again. So in comparison, the Leaf ending basically says that I have accepted what happened. The Water ending says I can't live with what happened. And Maria says I found another way to not think about what happened. And suddenly the endings aren't just different outcomes to the game. They are different forms of psychological resolution. And this brings us back to the beginning. Something was missing from the soundtrack. At first I thought it was something obvious, something surface level, like a rhythm or a melody, instrument perhaps. But it wasn't any of those things. It was resolution. The music constantly creates a tension without giving us a resolution to it. And James is basically doing the same thing. He is afraid of where the resolution might take him. So he's avoiding it. He wants an answer, but doesn't necessarily want the truth. He is stuck, and the music is stuck with him. So maybe the soundtrack of Silent Hill isn't unfinished at all. Maybe it's doing something that it's exactly supposed to do. It's leaving us with the same feeling that James has been feeling throughout the whole game. Something is missing. Something is not resolved. And we desperately want it to be, without having to face the consequences that comes with the resolution. Thanks for watching.